I'm Rivka Kahan, and we're going to use al-Torah resources to explore one of the most enigmatic narratives of the whole Torah, the story of the Chatan Damim, which takes place at one of the most climactic junctures of the Torah, just as Moshe Rabbeinu is preparing to step onto the stage of history to initiate the process of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Let's begin by looking together at the verses in which the Torah tells us the story of the Chatan Damim in Shmot Perek Daled, as Moshe and his family are returning from Midian to Mitzrayim so that Moshe can confront Paro. Let's click on Tanakh and then on Mikraot Gedolot. We're going to click here to select our text. We want to look at Shmot Perek Daled, and we're going to click here to look just at the Psukim for now. Let's start with Pasuk Kaf Daled. Vayi v'derech b'Malon vayifkeshehu Hashem vayivakesh hamito. The Torah tells us, at an inn on the way, Hashem encountered him and sought to kill him. Vatikach tzipor atzur vatichrot et orlat bena vatagal ragla vatomer ki chatan damim atali. Tzipora took a flint and cut off the foreskin of her son and touched it to his legs and said, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." Vayiref mimanu az amra chatan damim lamulot. He released him, and then she said, "A bridegroom of blood of the circumcision." So we see right away that there are many questions that arise even from a cursory reading of these verses. We're going to focus just on 3 questions. The first is, whom is Hashem seeking to kill in this narrative, and why? Second, how does this short and perplexing story fit into the surrounding story of Yetziat Mitzrayim? And third, in light of the preceding chapters in which Moshe has finally agreed to accept Hashem's mission of returning to Egypt to redeem the Jews, why would Hashem seek to thwart him at this point in his journey? This question becomes even sharper in light of the rabbinic notion that shluchei mitzvah einan nizoken. People on their way to perform a mitzvah are not harmed. We're going to delve into all of these questions through the lens of Parshanut. But first, let's use the tools that we have to analyze the linguistic characteristics of this section so that we can see which words appear with the greatest frequency and what they teach us about the theme and tone of this section. Let's go now to our Tanakh lab by going to Tanakh and then down to Tanakh lab. We're going to analyze just one text, so we're going to put into this box our text, Shmot Perek Daled. We're going to look at both our verses and the surrounding verses just to give us some context. So we'll start with verse 18 and go through the end of the Perek, verse 31. We see right away that some of the words that come up with greatest frequency are verbs like halach and shalach and shuv, which seem to underscore the idea that we said that in this section Moshe is returning to Mitzrayim to carry out Hashem's mission. And this requires us to understand why Hashem would seek to thwart him at this point. I want to focus on one other word that comes up with great frequency, which is the shoresh pei gimel shin, usually translated as to meet or to encounter. In fact, the precise form vayifkeshehu appears only twice in Tanakh, both in Shmot Perek Daled, including in the story of the Chatan Damim. Let's look at the other places in Tanakh in which this shoresh appears by clicking here. So if you look through the verses in which this shoresh appears, you'll see that while it sometimes means to meet or to encounter in a neutral sense, more often than not, it connotes a violent or contentious meeting or attack. And that's certainly the case in the only other verse in Tanakh in which Hashem is the subject of the verb, which is Hosea Perek Yud Gimel Pasuk Chet. So this underscores the idea that the meeting between Hashem and Moshe's family in this section is a contentious one, is a violent one. And it requires us to understand why Hashem treats Moshe and his family with such harshness. Now let's return to the Mikraot Gedolot to see how some of our commentaries have understood this story. We're going to look at the commentaries of Rashi and of the Haktav HaKabbalah written by Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg and of Shadal, Shmuel David Lutzato. Let's begin with Rashi on Pasuk Kaf Daled. So Rashi said, "Vayivakesh hamito lefi shelo mal et Eliezer beno," that Hashem sought to kill Moshe because he had not performed a Brit Milah on his son Eliezer. And Rashi goes on to explain that Moshe had only the best of intentions, that Moshe did not want to perform a Milah on Eliezer just as they were about to begin a perilous journey, and he also didn't want to delay Hashem's mission. But nonetheless, Rashi explains that Moshe did not perform the Brit Milah at the earliest possible opportunity, and thus didn't demonstrate sufficient energy and alacrity in performing this mitzvah, and that's why he was punished by Hashem. It's a little bit hard to understand without further analysis why Hashem would respond so harshly to what seems to be an innocent error in judgment in Moshe's part. So we'll need to think more about that, as well as about the other philosophical questions that we've raised. It's worth pointing out that the Ibn Ezra quotes Rav Shmuel ben Chafni, although he doesn't agree with him, and points out that Rav Shmuel ben Chafni says that the person who was in danger in this section was not Moshe, but Eliezer. And it seems that Rav Shmuel ben Chafni is motivated by the notion of Shluchei Mitzvahim and Nizokin, to say that it was not Moshe who was in danger of dying for failing to perform the Brit on Eliezer, but rather Eliezer himself. But nonetheless, even this approach does not fully address the philosophical questions that we've raised. Let's look at one very fascinating and creative interpretation, which is suggested by Haktav HaKabbalah. Haktav HaKabbalah suggests that the subject of Vayivakesh Hamito is actually not Hashem. Hashem actually did not seek to kill anyone in this section. The Haktav HaKabbalah says, V'lulei dat kadmonenu hayiti omer she'ein Vayivakesh Hamito musav al Hashem rak al Moshe. It says that actually the subject of this verb is Moshe, that Moshe sought his own death. Moshe was so filled with remorse and regret when he realized his mistake that he actually wanted to die. And Haktav HaKabbalah compares this to Yonah Hanavi, who would prefer his own death rather than seeing the harm that would befall Bnei Israel as a result of his actions. So in this sense, Haktav HaKabbalah is trying to help us understand the section philosophically by saying Hashem actually did not respond with great harshness, but rather Moshe realized his own mistake and was filled with overwhelming regret that he had done something wrong in his relationship with Hashem. Let's look at one other interpretation and then we'll consider them all together. The very fascinating interpretation of Shadal. So Shadal's view is that the problem with Moshe's behavior in this section is not only about the Brit Milah, but rather that as a general matter, Moshe is demonstrating a lack of full and total commitment to his mission, and that this comes out in a few different ways. First, Shadal considers it inconceivable that Moshe would take a newborn baby on the perilous journey back to Egypt, and therefore Shadal believes that we have to assume that Moshe's sons were older. And therefore, we have to answer why had Moshe not yet performed a Brit Milah on both of his sons, including Eliezer, if they were not newborn babies anymore. So Shadal suggests that we should assume that Moshe was following the custom of Tzipporah's family, which was to perform a Brit Milah at age 13. And that's why only one of his sons had a Brit Milah and not Eliezer. Shadal also says that Moshe demonstrated insufficient commitment to the Brit and to his mission by bringing Tzipporah and his family back with him to Egypt. This is particularly the case since we see that in the preceding psukim that Moshe did not explain clearly to Yitro and to Tzipporah why he was returning to Egypt. He made it sound as if he were just returning to visit his family. So given that he had already demonstrated that he listened to Tzipporah in the matter of the Brit Milah for their sons, and that he wasn't clear and explicit and strong in explaining why he was returning to Egypt, and that it makes a lot of sense to assume, it's logical to think that Tzipporah, when she found out why they were actually going back to Egypt, would prevail upon Moshe not to endanger their family by confronting Paro and by making him angry. In all of these different ways, Shadal suggests that even though Moshe is returning and does seem to have accepted Hashem's mission, he is not fully committed to it. And he's demonstrating that lack of commitment. And that was really the problem here. And that was why Hashem responded so harshly. In Shadal's view, it's actually not Eliezer or Moshe who were attacked by Hashem, but it's Gershom. And the reason that Gershom was attacked, even though the problem was that Moshe didn't perform a Brit on Eliezer, is because of Gershom's special symbolic status as the Bechor of the family and all that that represents. So when we consider all of these different approaches, and there are many other Mefarshim that are fascinating and very much worth reading and considering, but when we consider the approaches that we've seen, perhaps we can suggest how this story fits into the surrounding narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim and how we understand its messages. The story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is the fulfillment of the Brit that Hashem makes with Abraham and his descendants, both at Brit Bein HaBetzarim in Breshit Perek Tet Vav and at Brit Milah in Breshit Perek Yod Zayin. And perhaps by not performing a Brit Milah on his own son, Moshe Rabbeinu demonstrated a lack of full commitment to and understanding of that Brit. And that could help us understand why Hashem would respond so harshly in the view of Rashi, or alternatively, why Moshe himself would be filled with such intense remorse and regret when he realized his mistake in the view of Haktav HaKabbalah. And perhaps we can also integrate or consider the ideas of Shadal, who suggest other ways in which Moshe Rabbeinu did not demonstrate at this juncture in the story sufficient, full, and wholehearted commitment to his mission and to the Brit that it represented. So in all of these ways, we see that perhaps the message of the story of the Chatan Damim is that it requires Moshe, by performing a Brit on his own son, to deepen his personal commitment to the Brit between Hashem and the Jewish people, and his own personal mission in bringing that Brit to realization. In general, in the Torah, the national and the personal are always intertwined. Before Moshe can appear on the stage of Jewish history as the Redeemer of Bnei Israel, he must himself in his own life and in his own personal relationships demonstrate a full and sincere and wholehearted commitment to the Brit and all that it represents. To learn more about this topic and about others, please visit al-hatorah.org. Thank you.